Welcome to another one of my web chats. Today's topic is on research methods with particular focus on ANOVA, or analysis of variance. We welcome Assistant Professor Wolfram Verlaan from the University of Alabama in Huntsville to the discussion today. So thanks so much for joining us, Wolf.
I'm glad to be here, Evan.
Could you tell us a little bit about your research interest and/or expertise?
Okay. I'm not sure about expertise. A few people maybe like to claim that, but my research interests stem around the comparisons of reading and listening comprehension. So I'm interested in how listening comprehension contributes to reading comprehension. I also work a lot with pre-service teachers, so I'm also interested in teacher preparation and best methods for doing that. And I'm also interested in struggling readers and students coming from perhaps underserved backgrounds and how they struggle in the classroom, and interests in helping those, typically students from Title I backgrounds, things like that. So those would be my main research interests.
And I guess some of that spurs from your initial classroom teaching experience in working with students in Texas and being a national board certified and the like.
Yeah, that's correct. I taught middle and high school for approximately 8.5 years. And all of those were spent in Title I schools in Texas. So middle and high school, probably a few more years in middle school than in high school. But having worked with students coming from a variety of different backgrounds, they weren't just Title I students, but having come from a variety of different backgrounds, I've become quite interested in ways we can help struggling readers and help them in a variety of areas in the classroom in a variety of subjects.
Absolutely, and I think many of those pedagogical practices that assist those types of students are sort of the epicenter of why we do research, right? So it's not just to do research for numbers' sake, but to really have a pedagogical goal in mind, much like you talked about your interest in listening and reading comprehension and so forth. So let's go ahead and take it into the conversation about some of these research methods. And the first guiding question that I wanted to look at is, when you select appropriate research methods for your study, is that the first thing that you think about, or do you think about the topic first? And how is that situated when you go to plan a research study?
Yes, I think typically what happens is you decide on a research question first. What's the question I want to answer? And it really does come down to just a question. I think for myself, for example, if I look at my dissertation research, say, I was wanting to know, do kids, is a student's listening comprehension, or average student's listening comprehension, is it better or worse in their reading comprehension at different grade levels? Mm-hmm. And so knowing that, I tested kids' reading levels at 4th grade, 6th grade, and 8th grade, and also their comprehension levels at those, or listening comprehension levels at those same grade levels. Since I was comparing 4th grade listening and reading, and then 6th grade listening and reading, 8th grade listening and reading, I was comparing two means, okay? And typically two means is a t-test is pretty straightforward. Since the subject of the conversation today is targeted more towards ANOVA, right? ANOVA would come in if you were maybe comparing 3 different means. Mm-hmm. And this actually came up in a study I did recently with one of my graduate students, where we were looking at how much kids were improving over the year in her classroom. And she was comparing 2 different groups of students. But what you wanted to look at was, how much do student-led parent conferences seem to help a group of students. And so she had 3 different points at which she was comparing or measuring student performance using, in this case, it was Renaissance Learning's STAR test, just a simple comprehension measure. And she looked at the beginning of the year, the middle of the year, and the end of the year. Now, in that case, you could do something like multiple t-tests, compare the beginning and middle of the year and then the middle of end of the year. But there are statistical problems that come in when you do that. You start to lose some statistical power. And so a much better way of doing something like that is using an ANOVA. And a repeated measures ANOVA, or an ANOVA where you compare different levels of an independent variable, is very common. For example, in medicine, right, you may look at what is the outcome on a dependent variable. Of course, medical testing might be slightly easier in terms of external factors, but you might say, what is the outcome of on blood pressure? Say if I give 10 milligrams of this drug, 20, 30, 40, or 50, right? And so you would compare the different blood pressure means, however you measure that, and then you would actually use ANOVA to determine whether or not there was a difference between those. We actually did find that there was that the kids had growth in our particular area between the beginning and end of the year. The problem with an ANOVA is, though, that it doesn't necessarily tell you where the growth is. So did they grow, I should say, did they grow in a statistically significant manner between the beginning and middle of the year, right? Between the middle and end of the year, or just between the beginning and the end? Or was it, for each one of those? And so once you've done something like an ANOVA, right, you do need to go back and analyze and do what are called post-hoc tests, and there are a number of those, right, that you can go back and compare and see, okay, so where were there actual differences between the different levels of my independent measure? So.
Absolutely, and I think also, some of those limitations that you mentioned about ANOVA and sort of a strictly quantitative design could also be addressed if you were doing more of a mixed method study. Let's say that you were combining that alongside patient interviews and, ongoing observations of people's workout regimens or whatever it was in that case, to really try to, I guess, understand and explicate what's going on behind those numbers, right?
Yeah, that's you bring up a good point, because in this particular, I guess, experiment we did, and it wasn't, I guess you could call it an experiment of sorts, but it was more an action research type of project. What we found was that, if you just measured kids at the beginning, middle, and end of the year, right, to see what their growth was, it really wouldn't tell you much about why they grew. Okay. So what we actually did was we looked at, for example, a number of student-led parent conferences that students had. We also sent surveys home with students, asking them about their attitudes towards school, and sent surveys home to parents to ask parents about what they perceive their students' attitudes towards school to be, say, at the beginning of the year and then the end of the year. And so we also wanted to look at, okay, if their reading improved, what factors might that be attributed to? Is it because maybe their attitudes towards school changed? Did they improve, not only from the student standpoint, but also from the parent standpoint? So it's important, I think, to sometimes expand our analysis of the data, or maybe mediate our analysis of the data with mixed methods or qualitative type of data, which gives us more of an insight into, or helps us explain, I guess, what our quantitative data actually means.
Right. So if I were to try to summarize why we would use ANOVAs, would you agree with me and maybe expound upon it in terms of, we're looking to see differences in groups. Typically we're going to have one dependent variable and one or more independent variables. And depending on those number of independent variables is to exactly what type of, ANOVA that we would run, whether it be a one-way, a repeated measures, correlated groups, etc.
Yes, that's correct, and that's typically why you run ANOVA is when you have different means that you want to compare, different levels of a variable, different amounts or quantities, more than two. When you typically have three different things you want to compare with each other, I should say three or more that you want to compare with each other, and ANOVA is the statistically preferable way of doing that.
Mhm.
And there are, of course, different types of ANOVAs you can run. You can also look for covariance. You can look for multiple issues of covariance. There's actually, quite a bit of literature available. I'm not an expert on ANOVA. I ran, repeated measures, and I know how to do simple types of things like that. But if I had to do a much more complicated study, I would certainly be going back to a book to refresh my memory, or even going to maybe an outside person with more statistical knowledge to get their advice on maybe how to set up the experiment, or how to set up running, say, the SPSS program, or what other type of statistical software I might be using to crunch the numbers.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's what I was really going to try to touch upon as well, in terms of, as researchers, even though we have some areas of expertise and we are out there in the field, we also crunch the numbers here. That's not to say that we don't forget some things if we haven't run a particular test in 3 to 5 years, for instance. It's not to say that we know everything about SPSS or SAS, and that those sometimes those manuals like SPSS for Dummies, or how-to guides to how to run these these tests, these measures, but also what they mean, right? Sometimes we need those refreshers, even though we are the people in the field doing all the work ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. The internet actually is a wealth of information, depending on which websites you go to. Sometimes there's websites out there that you can find that are written by statisticians for statisticians, and they might be a little bit more in depth than you may need. On the other hand, there's often good information on the internet. There's some books that are actually pretty good. One I like to use, is not bad, is the SPSS Survival Manual. Okay. And there's different versions of it out there. It's not as in-depth in terms of explaining all the nuances and why you would run one test as opposed to another, but it certainly gives you enough background and tells you how to go through SPSS and run a particular test. I think a book that often is used quite a bit is Discovering Statistics Using SPSS, and I'm not sure what edition this is in.
I have that one as well.
Yes, yes, and books like this, you find yourself going back to them just to refresh your memory, and that, combined with maybe the internet, or even talking with colleagues that may do this more often, can be very helpful. It's very much like other types of math-based things. I've had a course in calculus a long time ago, but I'd have to go back to my calculus book, because math is very, use it or lose it. So if you haven't done it in a long time, it's the same thing with SPSS. Luckily, it's things like that are pretty easy to use, and there are lots of resources out there to help us go through it. But yeah, certainly part of being a researcher is one, being able to locate some of the information ourselves and kind of keep abreast of that as we go through. I think another thing that can be quite helpful is, as you're reading research articles, especially if you're starting to do your own research and you're doing a particular method. Like, for example, I'm doing some regression now on an article I'm working on. Is I've read several other research articles that may actually be looking, if not at the same thing, they've structured their design, their research design, statistical design, in a similar fashion, and you can kind of look at what they did for a guide, and it starts to make some sense, or can help maybe clarify how you're doing things. And
absolutely, I think both with design. We also talked about earlier in this course about borrowing or stealing the stylistic features of academic writing. And so, we become learned from learning from the experts, right?
Yes.
It's like I always say Stephen King or John Grisham, they are good writers because they're well read in part.
Yes.
And it's so familiarizing ourselves with the literature, seeing what other kinds of studies have been done using ANOVA in this case, and seeing if that applies to the study that you're looking to run, and if that's the best case, type of analysis for that project.
Yes, absolutely. And looking at different research articles and looking at, say, their methods section, right, gives you an idea of so how am I going to write my methods and how am I going to write my results section?
Because running it is one thing and writing it up is, and again,
exactly.
So, and I think some people are better versed at one as opposed to the other as well. So it always helps to continue to increase, our network connections. I think Wolf and I have gone back and forth on a number of methods over the years as well.
Yes.
And hopefully that continues. So I really want to thank you for joining the discussion today with us. It was very informative, and I hope that you'll be willing to join us at a later session as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And in terms of statistics, if you get lost, Google is your friend. You'll get more information about statistics than you've ever wanted to read.
Absolutely. I always say Google is the new father. Instead of going to your dad, you just, type it up on Google.
Right.
So thanks again, Wolf, and we'll talk soon.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Evan.
Ciao.